most of us who've been part of this community know Karis Daniel for her involvement in the Bird Pics project, one of the virtual museum projects. And Karis is looking at using bird photographs essentially to develop distribution maps and to see how these can then, the work that's done in this project, how it can then be utilized in other virtual museum projects where we don't have the kind of levels of data that we do have for the Bird Atlas project, but we have a photographic record, whether that can be used to determine distribution, fairly accurate distribution, distributions of species. So, but Karis's work and her research is much broader than that, and I think many of us who have scientific backgrounds are also very avid citizen scientists and love to contribute to the citizen science part, to research. And Karis is definitely one of us in that regard. And she is also looking at it the other way around, looking at how biodiversity benefits from citizen science. A lot of the time we talk about how citizen scientists and the work they do benefit research, but we're looking at her study. Another aspect of her study is looking at it from the other way. So, Karis, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say this evening, to hearing your presentation on how citizen science as a discipline contributes, yes, to scientific research, but it also plays a key role in creating awareness and attitudes and lifestyles that are conservation based in communities, in the areas where biodiversity occurs. So without further ado, Karis, over to you.
All right. So thank you, Rick, for the introduction. Some of you may remember that I spoke at the very first of these Citizen Science Hours back in June of last year. And even though that was only about 6 or 7 months ago, it feels like an eternity has passed since then. And I think we've all aged a bit in different ways. And this lockdown for me has really forced me to reevaluate things that are most important in life. And for me, that part of that process of evaluation has looked like an expansion of my research to incorporate factors which I really believe are essential to ensuring the successful persistence and longevity of any conservation work. And those are social and cultural dynamics, like Rick mentioned. So in trying to decide how to structure this talk in a kind of palatable way, what I've settled on is just focusing on one aspect of the research, which is the human aspect, and really just diving into the reasoning and theory behind that, and then moving into the application and a bit of the research process itself. So that's kind of my trajectory for the evening. I'm going to do my best to stick to the time allotted, but please hold me to that. So just to briefly introduce you to what I spoke about last time and what my focus is. In the big picture, I study citizen science and conservation with a particular focus on birds. And the left side of this flowchart here shows you what has comprised the focus of my master's research and part of my current work as well. And that is quantifying and visualizing the value that opportunistic citizen science data brings to conservation. In other words, testing the quality and the potential for conservation applications of citizen science data sets. And Les spoke about this briefly a couple of weeks ago at the last Citizen Science Hour, but that process involves using data from the virtual museum to generate species distribution maps for South African birds, and then quantitatively comparing those maps to data from the South African Bird Atlas project, which employs a much more structured collection protocol and operates at a finer geographic scale than the virtual museum. Now, I started doing this with birds, but as Rick mentioned, our hope for the long term is to apply similar methodology to other virtual museum databases, such as for the lepidopterans and lacewings and scorpions, with the hope of then having distribution maps for those taxa as well, which can be used for conservation management and planning. So in the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of time on this left side of the flowchart, and I spoke about it last time. So today, I actually want to focus a bit more on the other side, much of which I think will be quite new to all of us, and all of which I find equally exciting. So let's dive in. See, the challenge is that while the distribution information that we get from the scientific analysis of citizen science data is incredibly valuable for conservation planning purposes, it actually doesn't guarantee long-term sustainable change. And over the past almost 2 years now, I've come to realize that this is because we're approaching these citizen science databases with our only question being, what value does this bring to scientific research? And I think to approach any problem through just one lens paints an incomplete picture. We're missing or overlooking components of these complex systems which interact to either prevent or exacerbate biodiversity loss. Now, in September of last year, the United Nations held a virtual Global Biodiversity Summit, and the President of the General Assembly stated this, that our existence on this planet depends entirely on our ability to protect the natural world around us. Now, when we consider that biodiversity loss is likely the single greatest global challenge that we currently face, it very quickly becomes evident that this is a public problem, and it's not something that we should be dealing with privately. It's not just the scientific community which plays a part. In fact, our presence is quite small. We need to be placing equal emphasis on understanding the faces behind our citizen science projects and asking not just what value do people bring to science, but also how does citizen science change people? Because humans aren't just part of the ecosystem, we've become drivers of it, especially in the past few decades, and change therefore has to start at the individual level. So why is it so important to include people, in particular citizen scientists, in the picture when we're talking about conservation? Well, last year, a large network of researchers worked with the United Nations to produce a series of publications, which are called the Blue Papers, and they detailed the human relationship with our ocean planet. And what I found fascinating about that research was its focus on value, specifically the non-monetary value that humans derive from the ocean. And those included things like contributions to social and legal identity, sense of place, occupational pride, self-respect, spirituality, mental health, bodily health, human security, etc., etc. And the fact is that these same values exist on the broader scale of biodiversity. And there are as many possible relationships with our planet's biodiversity as there are people who interact with it. There is no one definitive value with which all people will identify, because every person carries a unique set of personal and cultural connections and experiences which shape their relationship with biodiversity. So what does that mean for us? Well, simply, we cannot base our conservation policy decisions on one set of values and still expect that policy to persist. Instead, we need to incorporate the voices and value systems of a diverse range of individuals who live and work and interact with biodiversity into decision-making processes regarding its stewardship. Long-term change starts with individuals. And that's really where citizen science becomes so critical. See, citizen scientists are quite unique in their relationship to the natural world in that they have a deeper understanding of how it works. I like to say that we don't spend time outdoors, we invest time outdoors. And what we get back, among other unique personal benefits, is an ecologically grounded worldview. And that's significant for two main reasons. First, we now have a community which acts like a bridge between the scientific community and the broader public. It's this group of non-scientists with vast environmental knowledge. And secondly, in that role, this group is now capable of embodying a process called the democratization of science. It's a process of equipping with scientific knowledge and restoring decision-making power to the people who are most closely linked to the land and its well-being. So it sounds fantastic, but how do we accomplish that practically? Well, when a community of citizen scientists begins to take ownership within a region, they're able to reach out to others in a way that the scientific community cannot do on its own. And these individuals act like an early warning system. They notice changes in the world around them. They call attention to the changes within their immediate social circles, and then they're able to galvanize local communities and governance into action. And part of what I want to achieve through this research is to present the case that careful project structure and implementation can build off of these existing strengths to create and maintain generational frameworks of environmental stewardship, with families and community members passing on a deep-rooted value for biodiversity, which will spill over into local and regional and governmental environmental policy. And what makes these frameworks so powerful is that they can autonomize. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I'm using it. Eventually, they begin to operate not outside of, but independent of the scientific community. And that's really our goal, isn't it? That we won't always need to preach the same message, that through individual transformation and building these ecologically grounded worldviews at the individual level, biodiversity conservation will become a chosen lifestyle rather than a forced agenda. And science then can begin to invest its energy and resources into guidance or shepherding, if you will, rather than converting. So at this level, conservation is really the work of reshaping worldviews. So main points to take away from that first bit. Humans are not just part of the ecosystem, we are drivers of it. Change, therefore, has to start at the individual level. And citizen science is uniquely well suited to building those ecological worldviews, which will prove, I think, essential in the battle to protect our biodiversity. Okay, so it's time to take a turn. I've given you a little bit of the reasoning, and it's time to move towards application now. How the heck do we test and measure all of that? It's a very good question, one which to some extent I'm still wrestling with, but I will do my best to give you an overview of where we are right now in terms of planned research. So in order to build citizen science projects to their fullest potential, to equip citizen scientists to serve as those prophets or ambassadors for biodiversity within their communities, we really need to understand the personal impact of our current projects. What's working, what's not working, and how participants are responding. And to do that, we start with citizen scientists, which means we start with you. And one potential means of measuring impact lies in an analysis of individual decision-making. And for that, we're going to need a couple of tools. And the first is called the VRK framework, values, rules, and knowledge. This was first proposed, I think, in 2016 by a team of researchers in Australia, that decision-making is influenced by three primary societal factors, values, rules, and knowledge. And those three factors comprise the framework which decision-makers use when they're making a choice. It's also called the decision-making context. And decisions, in this case, can manifest as individual lifestyle changes, like maybe a choice to spend more time outdoors in nature, or as community policy, So maybe a municipal decision to convert an empty plot of land into a nature garden for the neighborhood. And in order to implement change, the decision maker has to desire a specific outcome, which is the value. They need to be able to choose and achieve that outcome, which is rules. And they need to be aware and informed regarding the consequences of their decision, and that's knowledge. Now, this framework has already been applied in conservation research to analyze both marine and terrestrial conservation decision-making, including in South Africa for butterfly research. However, it has yet to be applied to the field of citizen science. So we are stepping out a bit here, but I think this will prove a really useful metric for measuring the impact of citizen science participation on participant decision-making. So that's our first tool, the BRK framework. And the second is also an acronym, NCP, which is Nature's Contributions to People. And this connects back to that UN Blue Paper research on values that I mentioned earlier. NCP is a way of evaluating the natural world outside of an economically driven valuation system. As an example, many of you are probably familiar with the term ecosystem services. It's typically used to describe things like pollination, seed dispersal, carbon sequestration, things that we perceive as sort of vital giveaways from the ecosystem. And though I think it is shifting gradually to become more inclusive, that term still typically only refers to what can be called instrumental values, which are namely scientific and economic assessments of environmental value. And again, with that, we're missing a lot of critical relational values. Alongside the economic and the scientific, we need to include the cultural, the social, biophysical, health-related, experiential, and so on. So in short, NCP encompasses the suite of contributions, both positive and negative, which we perceive nature bringing to human life, human quality of life. So we have the VRK framework for understanding what drives decision-making, and we have NCP for understanding what values people perceive in the natural world. So those are the two tools in our toolkit, or the weapons in our arsenal. Now we need a place to apply them. What pool of individuals do we draw from? And what project do we study? Well, within South Africa, the Bird Atlas project is really an ideal choice because there is a long-running, well-established chapter, the Southern African Bird Atlas project. But there are also relatively young chapters within continental Africa, such as in Nigeria. And having those two projects, which have the same collection protocol and design, but in such contrasting timeframes and cultural contexts, gives us a really cool opportunity to compare the impact of an established and a fairly new project, and to look at how structure and impact vary between these two distinct cultural contexts. So in particular, we have chosen to focus on Atlasan communities in Stilbaai, here in the Western Cape, and the Nigerian Bird Atlas project. So building on our VRK and NCP frameworks, we now have two options for collecting data. First, we can use structured conversational interviews to explore a range of topics with participants, including conservation-related behavior, perceptions of the scientific community, perceived impact of participation on personal lifestyle choices. And we can also analyze impact at a community level, asking what impact this group of volunteers has on people who interact with them indirectly. So in this case, it would be residents and local landowners. And we can ask questions like, how does the presence of citizen science project members with those ecologically grounded worldviews impact overall community attitudes toward local biodiversity? And our second option then is a written survey instrument, which would provide a more direct valuation of things like environmental knowledge and environmental connectedness, likelihood to engage others in a citizen science project, so to incorporate family or friends or colleagues, And we would just ask respondents to rank responses to certain statements or to select a statement which most closely aligns with their personal view. Now, as you've probably noticed, these data are no longer quantitative or numeric, rather they are qualitative, and that makes analysis a little bit more complex. But thankfully, we have some really remarkable technology which makes this possible and actually quite straightforward. There's a brilliant text analysis software program called MaxQDA, which will code interview transcripts based on the frameworks that we supply. So in this case, it would be the VRK and NCP models, which I described earlier. And during that process, the software is essentially pulling up patterns in the transcripts and identifying those primary categories of values and rules and knowledge which are driving decision-making, as well as typifying and creating categories for NCP. Now, for the actual process of data collection, distance, both physical distance and conceptual distance, is going to be very, very important, because we'll need to conduct interviews with people at varying distances of involvement or degrees of relatedness, maybe, to the citizen science project itself. So both regular and casual members of the Atlassian community, non-participants who know of the project and are familiar with it, as well as non-participants who are unaware of the project or maybe have no familiarity with it. We'll also need to space interviews out geographically, starting at the locational center of the project. So in Stillby, we would start at the Atlassian community and then conducting interviews increasingly further from that center point, because this will allow us to determine how perceived NCPs shift in relation to both geographical and conceptual proximity to the citizen science project. And for that VRK framework, if participation in the Atlas project does transform individual conservation-related decision-making, then broadly we would expect those who are closer to citizen science projects, both physically and conceptually, to articulate a greater diversity of conservation-related values, a stronger understanding of community and municipal conservation rules, and a deeper scientific knowledge than those who are further removed from the project. So what will these analyses ultimately tell us? Well, it's a bit like a clinical trial, and I'm realizing now that this metaphor is a bit cheeky in light of current events, but bear with me. If you think of biodiversity loss as a disease caused, among other reasons, by worldviews which are disconnected from nature, and then we think of citizen science as a new therapeutic medication, this study is almost like a way of monitoring how effective the drug is at fighting the disease. It's a way of determining the impact of our citizen science projects on individuals and communities within the greater context and goals of conservation. Okay, so to wrap sort of everything up that we've covered so far, scientific analysis is only one piece of the puzzle. And successful biodiversity conservation requires incorporating multiple value systems into policy and governance. And change, therefore, starts with reshaping individual worldviews. Citizen scientists occupy a unique position to serve as really powerful intermediaries between the scientific community and the broader public. And we can strengthen their position by structuring our projects in a way which maximizes their social impact. But to do this, we need to understand current impact. And that's the purpose of this portion of the research. Now, you may or may not have been wondering why I chose to title this talk, "It Takes a Village." And if you're familiar with the expression, it's one of several old proverbs which all roughly equate to the statement, "It takes a village to raise a child." And I love that because it's a statement of collective social responsibility. All members of the community play a part in a child's growth and flourishing. And the truth is that our world, especially with ever-increasing globalization, has, in a very real way, become our proverbial village. And as I hope this is demonstrated this evening, we require collective interdisciplinary action to affect change and to protect our biodiversity for the following generation. It really does take a village. This is just one portion of the project, which we're hoping to pull off in the next couple of years. There's also another data-based component also centered on the Atlas project in Stillby, and dealing with coverage statistics, which Liz spoke about a couple of weeks ago. And I'd be very keen to share that as well at some point, maybe in a future Citizen Science Hour. But for now, this has just been a quick dip into the human aspects of the research, which will be underway very soon. And yeah, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share it, and would be really keen to hear your thoughts or take any questions you might have. So thanks.
Fantastic, Karis. Thank you. What a wonderful presentation, and what a wonderful concept. I think that those are quite moving words. It takes a village to raise a child, and I think it's so apt to the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in and a part of. So thank you very much, and very well articulated, very professionally presented. Well done. Are there any questions at this stage? If not, many thanks coming in via the chat box. We can possibly look at some questions, answering some questions at the end of David's presentation.